So, some classic evals, growth and the relationship between growth and debt. Very, very important. Depends on growth rate. So, is debt a concern? We've said yes because of all these reasons. And I think you could broadly use this to evaluate all of them, that whether this is a concern or this is a concern or this is a concern depends on the economic growth rate. Now, this is very, very important because effectively, with any loan, with any borrowing, with any debt, I think there's often this view that debt is a bad word. You don't want to be in debt. But it's far too simplistic a view. All debt works in the following way: there is good debt and there is bad debt. Good debt is debt where money has been borrowed and used to make more money, right? So if you borrow £1,000 and you use it to make 1,100, that is good debt, as long as the interest rate is less than 10%. But let's say the interest rate is 5%, that's great debt. Everybody wins, right? You borrow £1,000, let's say at 5% interest. If you can turn that £1,000 into £1,100, you have to pay back 1,050. The borrower gets £50. You pocket the difference, which is £50. Literally everybody wins. So that's good debt. Bad debt is obviously debt which is not in some way used to create more money than was lent, and therefore cannot be paid back. Okay. In essence, then, how does an economy, how does the government pay back its debt, or how does it make it easier to pay back its debt? How does it have good debt instead of bad debt? It's if the economy can grow by effectively more than the interest rate on the debt, just as in my previous very simplistic example. So let's say the government is borrowing at 5% and it's borrowing, I don't know, £1,000, right? If it can turn that £1,000 into £1,100, it can pay back its debt and pocket the difference. Now, the reason economic growth is important is because, remember, the government's income is just a fraction, it's just a part of the economy's income, right? Where does the government get its income? It gets it from tax revenue, and the more income in the economy as a whole, which is GDP, the more tax revenue. So you could, it's not always this straightforward, but you could imagine that if GDP growth is 10%, the government's tax revenue might increase by 10% because the economy's income has increased 10%. So in this way, effectively, debt isn't necessarily a problem if the growth rate is high enough to pay off the interest effectively. You've only got issues, perhaps long term, if the growth rate is too low to support increasing interest payments. So I think depends on growth rate. That's a very, very important one, especially when it comes to austerity and whether you need to use austerity, because there's this huge, huge criticism of austerity, and I think it's really important actually to divert slightly and address this, and for you guys to make a note of this criticism of austerity. Think about what austerity does to GDP, right? Decreases it because you're going to lower government spending and increase taxes. Think about what we've just said about growth rates and debt. And I want you guys to put the answer in the chat here. What is the problem here? You use austerity to reduce your debt. That's the whole point. Austerity is a policy to improve the fiscal position. But using austerity is likely to decrease GDP. Can you guys spot the problem there? So you use austerity to decrease your debt problem. One of the consequences of austerity is it will decrease GDP. Devian, well done, good stuff. He has said it is unlikely that there will be a positive growth rate with austerity policies. Exactly, it will likely, according to ADAS model, decrease GDP. And think about what we've just said about what makes debt good or bad debt, what makes it concerning or unconcerning debt. Debt is more of a problem if you don't have high growth. if you have very high growth, you can support high debt. That's the essence of this argument. But the problem with austerity is it's going to reduce your GDP, which in the long term is going to make it harder to pay back your debt. So there was this big argument when austerity was brought in the UK that was saying, wait a second, does this make sense? Because we're going to decrease government spending to save money, but then the decrease in government spending is going to reduce the size of the economy, which is going to lose us money. So yes, we're going to save money, but we're also going to lose money. Maybe instead of austerity, we should be using growth policies. Why would you use growth policies instead of austerity? Because you can effectively grow your way out of debt, right? Like, again, just think about if you take a loan at 5% interest, if you can grow the money by more than 5%, you are good. So, in any effective situation of debt, whether you can pay it back, whether it's a problem, just depends on how much you can grow your pot of money by, right? Um, so again, just to make sure, because again, I have a feeling I've gone quite fast there. Any questions, put them in the chat, please. Otherwise, I'll move on to my next point, which is actually very related. It's a related point to what we've just had. All right, okay. I'm gonna assume slash hope we are more or less good to go. So another one here is depends on whether debt is what we call dead weight or reproductive. And this relates massively to the previous evaluative point, because deadweight debt is effectively when you borrow money on something that doesn't increase productivity or doesn't increase your income or your ability to produce. And reproductive debt is, as the name suggests, something that allows you to effectively reproduce the money you borrowed by growing your economy. So applied examples of this, putting this in a sort of real life context or hypothetical context, deadweight debt could be borrowing to fund a war. That is a really good example because a war is often a destructive exercise economically. So you'd be borrowing money and you likely to be spending it on something that just loses you more money instead of gains you money. Spending it on, well, if corruption is high, this could be a really good one actually. So if government officials in developing countries are borrowing money and then spending some of it on personal luxuries like swimming pools in their houses or whatever, then that's obviously deadweight debt. Reproductive borrowing to build schools, hospitals, infrastructure, blah blah blah. I think a very interesting point here, actually, that I almost forgot to mention, is that interest payments, which are going to be part of your spending requirement each year. So part of government spending is really on interest payments. Those are typically dead weight, right? Because paying off the interest on previous debt doesn't gain you anything. It doesn't get you like a new school or a new hospital. It's just interest. It's just basically a transfer of money from the government to an asset holder. So it doesn't necessarily gain any capital or anything reproductive. So again, if your interest payments are too high, you might have a lot of dead weight debt. And similar to what we were saying with debt traps, you could get in a situation where I guess you're borrowing more money to help you pay the interest. And like we said earlier, this is likely to lead to higher interest payments, and then you have to borrow money to help you pay off this higher interest and debt trap, debt cycle. So okay, another one that's very nice and easy. Depends on size relative to GDP. Now, I should probably note here that if you get an essay which says, is a high ratio of national debt to GDP a concern? You cannot use this evaluation, right? Obviously, because if the question says, is a ratio of high debt to GDP a concern, you can't say, it depends on the ratio of debt to GDP because the question's already said that ratio is high. If the question, and this is more typical, if the question just says, is national debt a concern? This is pretty much the easiest evaluation in the book. It's almost like the difference between total GDP or nominal GDP and sort of real or per capita GDP. So you have the total or absolute debt, which would be given as a numerical currency figure, e.g., the UK is around I think like 2.1 trillion pounds. And then the debt to GDP would be given as a ratio or percentage. It's almost always given as a percentage for the UK around 100%. And your argument is basically this number is way more important than this number. So the debt to GDP ratio is far more important than the total absolute debt size. So basically, a country like the UK is going to have a much higher total absolute debt than a country like Vatican City. I don't even know. Actually, I'm not going to use Vatican City. I chose it because it's very, very small. Let's go like Luxembourg. Okay, Luxembourg, very small country. The total debt is going to be very, very small compared to the UK. That's not necessarily a problem. It all depends on how much is their debt relative to the size of their economy. So let's say their debt is half the size of the UK's, but their economy is 1/10 the size of the UK's. That would suggest they've got a much bigger problem than us because their economy is 10 times smaller, which should mean their debt is 10 times smaller. If their debt was only half as much, again, that would mean they have really high debt to GDP ratio. So I will show a very easy example of how to use this evaluation when we look at the particular questions later on. So again, any questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to add another couple of evaluations. So first off, depends on whether debt is internal or external. So we have mentioned this before. This is something we've discussed. Can anybody maybe put a little reminder of what this refers to? I think Dev from my memory um, had a good point about internal versus external in the last session. Well, I can see so just put a question in, which I'll come to in a bit. So internal versus external debt, what's the difference there? If you need a clue, the key difference that we care about is how it's paid or what it needs to be paid in. I don't know if that's helpful at all. Niatia said exchange rates. Yes, yes, that is very relevant here. That is extremely, extremely relevant. What exactly is external debt, anybody? That's our key question here, right? What is the difference between internal and external debt? The clue is in the name, right? You've got your economy, national economy. What might internal debt be if a government has internal debt versus external debt? I don't know if I've given the specific definition. We definitely mentioned it, but again, I kind of let you guys to sort of common sense guess. All right, Dia and Devin, I think perfect. So Dia said external is where they borrow money from foreign lenders, and internal is where you borrow money, therefore, from domestic lenders, right? So what does this mean in simple terms? It's actually really, really simple. Let's say I buy a UK government bond for £100. Okay, I'm a UK citizen. I give the government £100 basically, They give me a bond, and the bond just basically says we'll give you back £110 in 5 years or something. So I give them £100, they give me a bond. Is this internal or external debt? You guys. I buy a bond. Devin says internal. Yep. Why? Because I'm a UK citizen. And if you think about it, when the government pays me back, which currency is it going to pay me back in? Pounds, obviously, right? I lent them because I earn pounds. I lent them £100. They're going to pay me back £100 plus the interest. And where is the money going to go when they pay me back? Anybody? In terms of which economy, which country, where is the money going to go when the government pays you back on this internal debt? Good Mira, good Niati, good Devian. Yes, the money stays in the UK economy in that case, right? And if you think about it, maybe that's not a problem, or it's not such a big problem, because when the UK government pays you back, it's not like that money leaves the UK economy. Yes, the government doesn't have it anymore, but someone else in the UK has it. Me. And what might I do? I might go out and spend it. So it's not like it's not a lost cause. But external debt, again, to put it very simply, would be if the same thing happens, but the other person is an American or a European, and they will basically be converting their own currency in order to buy the government bond, and they will want to be paid back in their own currency. So currency transfers are involved, which means exchange rates are involved, and that can be very, very damaging. I'll explain why later. But firstly, exchange rates are involved. And secondly, of course, let's say a foreign investor or a foreign government buys UK government bonds and the money gets paid back. Where does the money go in that case? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Not in the UK economy. It's going to leave the UK economy, and that's going to be a withdrawal from the circle flow. It's not going to potentially be spent in the UK. So you've got two reasons external debt is much worse and internal debt is much better. Reason number one, exchange rates, which again I'll explain in a bit. Reason number two, basically external debt is a withdrawal, internal debt is not. So internal debt, when it's repaid, stays within the UK, for example. External debt, when it's repaid, the money leaves the UK. So let's briefly talk about why exactly exchange rates is a problem. Again, I would refer you to the Mexican debt crisis in 1972, where one of the reasons Mexico defaulted on its debt was because a lot of its debt was external, specifically payable to the US in dollars. And the big problem was the Mexican peso depreciated massively against the dollar in the build up to the debt crisis. And if you borrow in another currency and your currency weakens or depreciates, if you borrow in another currency and your currency weakens, you will actually have to pay back more than you initially borrowed in your home currency, irrespective of interest rates. You can do a very, very simple example to show this. I don't know if I'll bother, maybe I will. But let's say you've got one peso equals, I don't know, $0.2, and then that drops to one peso equals $0.1. You can, yeah, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to give you guys the problem and you can work it out later if you want to. Work out what's the difference between borrowing $100 in the first instance. So let's say you borrow $100. How many pesos would the Mexican government have to spend? And then if the peso depreciates in the next few years, how much would they have to pay back $100? So okay, so again, hopefully that makes sense. Questions, stick them in the chat. I will possibly get around to answering some of the other ones I've seen. And then we might need to move on. Although there was another point, but okay, so I'll get round to the questions I've been asked, and again, any others, put them in the chat. So, Dev asked, where are you? How does a high ratio negate the problem of total debt? I assume that's in reference to this argument. That is the wrong way around. A high ratio of debt to GDP is bad. A low ratio of debt to GDP is good. The reason for that is think about what we said earlier. How do you pay back? How does the government pay back debt? With tax revenues. Where do tax revenues come from? GDP. So basically, if you have a high GDP relative to your debt, that suggests even if your debt is really high, you're making loads of money with which you can pay back that debt. But if you have a high debt to GDP ratio, or of course you could say a low GDP to debt ratio, if you have a high debt to GDP ratio, that suggests you are not going to have a large pool of national income with which to pay back the debt. If that makes sense, any follow-up questions, let me know. And then I think I've got a question from Mira here. Could you say internal debt doesn't really affect GNI, but external debt does? Yes, that should be accurate. I don't believe detailed knowledge of GNI is necessary for AQA. Very, very good that you know that or you're aware of it. But just for anyone else, if you're like, what is GNI? I don't think you need GNI for AQA. LXL, you need GNI. But anyway, so yes, and you are correct. External debt would affect GNI because it involves income being sent to other countries, but not GDP. Or at least it would contribute to GNI in a different way than to GDP. So that is correct. But again, for anyone else worrying, I don't get that. Don't worry, I don't think you need to. So okay, final point. Yeah, I'm going to risk overrunning this slightly, and I'm going to put this final point down. Uh, Evaluatively, this only you can only use if you get the fiscal deficit question. You cannot use this one for national debt, and I'll take out this one. Take out this one. So you can only use this if you get problems with a fiscal deficit, and that is because we can say depends whether the deficit. Actually, maybe you could use this for a national debt question, but you've got to word it quite carefully, and we're not going to go through that. If I'll leave you to work that out potentially. So it depends whether the deficit is cyclical or structural. Okay, so you cannot use this for national debt because there is no such thing as cyclical or structural national debt. There is only cyclical fiscal deficit and structural fiscal deficit. What is the difference? A cyclical fiscal deficit is basically a deficit which should be reduced in the boom phase of the economic cycle. So cyclical deficit is one that should be reduced or is expected to be reduced, go to a surplus basically in the boom phase of the economic cycle. Whereas a structural deficit is a deficit that remains in deficit even in the boom phase of the economic cycle. And I think the easiest way to understand this is actually with a very simple graph. So let's graph it up. Let's put it over here. So let's say we have positive and negative y-axes, and that shows the fiscal position. And positive is a surplus, so tax revenue higher than spending. Negative is a deficit, spending higher than tax revenue. And then on the x, we just have time. Okay, so a cyclical deficit looks like this, and a structural deficit looks like this. Can anybody explain why? You can use my definition here. Why does the black curve meet my definition of cyclical? Why does the red curve meet my definition of structural? Anybody. Did I go fast with the definitions? Did I rush you? I profusely apologize. Hope I'm not rushing you again now. Cyclical, decline, structural, red line. What's the difference? Okay, we've got an answer. Lovely mirror. The structure is always going to be negative. Basically, yes, yes, that's your key thing about a structural, right? You're always in a deficit, even in the boom phase of the economic cycle. But can anyone relate that in to the sort of the boom phase? Good answer from Niati as well. Cyclical like cancels out debt in the boom. So this is the boom, right? And then you've got a fiscal surplus. And then in a recession, you have a deficit. And then you go surplus and you have a deficit. Structural, you're always in deficit. In a boom, you just get a smaller deficit. And this is what the UK basically has. You have a smaller deficit in a boom and then a big deficit in a recession, but you're always in deficit. Why is this the boom phase? Why do you go to a surplus in a boom? So how does this relate to the economic cycle? Again, hopefully we covered this before, but just to remind, in a boom, high tax revenues, right? Because everyone's making loads of money in boom, companies are profitable, people are employed. So you make high tax revenues and government spending doesn't need to be that high. You don't have unemployed people to support, for example. So in a boom, typically you always earn more tax revenue and you don't need to spend as much. And then in a recession, you earn less tax revenue and you need to spend more. Um, so just think about, and it might be quite obvious, maybe, I don't know. Why could we say a cyclical deficit isn't really a problem, long term at least, but a structural deficit is very much a problem. And it kind of you can bring in national debt here if you want. You could bring in the concept of national debt. You don't have to. Answers in the chat. Keep it simple again if you can. Why is structural more of a problem than cyclical? Are you going to have a long-term national debt problem if you have a cyclical deficit? Okay, Niati, I think yes, dear, Diaz given me a good answer, but one that's more complicated than I wanted at this point. Niati's given me a very nice, simple structural increases national debt. Definitely, because you are always in deficit. If you are always in deficit, every year your debt increases. If you never get to surplus, you are never paying off any debt. If you're always in deficit, you're always needing to borrow money every single year. So your debt is always getting higher and higher and higher every single year. Cyclical, why might it be true that, and this is what I was looking for in addition to Niati telling me structural increases national debt, cyclical might do nothing to national debt as long as the ups is as big as the downs. Because yes, you borrow more money in the deficit, but then you can pay it back off in the surplus, etc., etc. So okay, that is our final evaluation point. You can see there's quite a lot of nice ones as well for this topic. I'm a big fan. I really like national debt essays. I think it's not often picked as a favorite, but it would probably be one of my favorites if it came up. Last time it came up was 2021 though, and it doesn't normally come up like every 2 or 3 years. Normally a few years between each one, so maybe not a hugely likely one. But anyway, all right. Sorry, I am rambling.